Good morning, welcome to our special holiday season campus seminar. Today we have done this before in some years, that at the beginning of the holiday season I try to have some special topic, like a student talked about her experiences on an icebreaker, so we got a little bit more into a Christmas mood here, seeing the pictures from the cold Arctic waters, and I think we had something similar in another year. And another year someone from Germany gave a presentation on how they went through the Arctic Sea on the icebreaker vessel Polarstern for a whole year, I think, or the whole winter season. And so now today it's not so much about cold weather, but it's another special presentation by John van Leer about more or less the history of the school to some extent. And I guess most of you know John very well, but if not, and for those who watch this on YouTube, here is a little introduction. He grew up in Maryland, I think the same town where James Christie was born. No? I thought. That's what you told me a while ago.
No, he lived in the same town.
Oh, he lived in the same town. Okay. So, okay. But there is some connection there. He got a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering in 1962 in Ohio, and then a doctorate degree in physical oceanography, working with Henry at Woods Hole in 1971. And right after getting the doctorate degree, you came here to Miami, to the Rosenstiel School. And I think that was also around the time when it was named Rosenstiel School, yeah. Right? So that's how it started. He's an expert for ocean instrumentation. He developed a fancy instrument called the cycle sonde, which was the first moored automatic ocean profiler that goes up and down. And with real-time telemetry, several generations were developed and many experiments were done. John spent about 4.5 years at sea, and about a third of that time as a chief scientist. He retired on August 31st, 2022, after exactly 51 years here at the school. And also after spending 45 years in his office, MSC 364, which is now my office. That's why we are friends. But that's one reason why we are friends. And that was converted from an apartment for visiting scientists to an office at that time. That's how he moved in. We'll probably talk about that in the presentation. As we can see, he is still active. He still comes from time to time here to have lunch with his friends and to chat with me about electric cars and his solar panels. And now he will talk about his memories from the early years of the school in the 1970s.
Thank you all for coming, and I'm especially glad to see Joe Prospero here, one of the so-called legends who are retired or soon to retire, eat together once a month as legends. So today I'm going to talk about how oceanography took rooted here at the University of Miami, and there are a whole bunch of different routes. There are deep tap routes, there are intermediate routes, all kinds of routes. There's even a Klaus route involved. So this is a program that goes back through the founding and so forth, but it's interwoven with my particular memories. Let's see. So to start off with my perspective, I was born in Washington, D.C. and schooled in Maryland, and that was a very fortunate thing at that time, because there was no television, there was no internet, there was none of the kind of communications we have today. So having been fortunate enough to be born in the nation's capital meant I had access to museums, to lectures and things that people in the hinterlands wouldn't have access to in those days. So I was extremely fortunate to do that. Among the things that we did, I attended National Geographic lectures as a child. My parents fed my curiosity, and so I got them. If I was good, I could stay up and go to National Geographic lectures in Constitutional Hall, which would be introduced by the Grosvenors, members, friends of the National Geographic Society, and so forth. And wonderful lectures. Among the most memorable of them were ones with Hillary climbing Mount Everest, and then especially important to me was Jacques Cousteau, who opened up the underwater world to me and to the society, and later to the more general world with his television series. Terrific storyteller, and the funding that we have enjoyed in oceanography over the years is in no small part due to the fact that Cousteau popularized underwater world that most of us were unaware of at the time. So it was an amazing thing, and for me, it continued. My dad was frugal, and one of the cheapest places you could stay near the shore was a place called Scientist Cliffs, which was a place where Smithsonian scientists were doing a dig in the Calvert Cliffs, unearthing things like megalodon teeth and so forth, and so they spent so much time down there in the summer that they would bring their families down and they built cottages. And so my dad would rent a cottage for a couple of weeks, and so I would get to interact with these Smithsonian scientists whether they liked it or not. It was just amazing to see. They had their own little museum, and it was an opportunity to understand what science was like and how it worked and who was involved. And so that was a terrific thing for me. So fast forward, I got a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering at Case in Cleveland, which was a private school that catered to industrial purposes. MIT was more oriented toward governmental projects and so forth. And I ended up taking a job at the MIT Instrumentation Lab doing reentry guidance systems for something that turned into the Minuteman and the MERV. And so I'm sort of one of the great-grandfathers of Minuteman. So if Mr. Putin does something really bad, that might be involved. I hope not. Anyway, so I was lucky enough to be able to take part in that. It was an amazing group of people who were changing and disrupting the way that guidance systems were made. Very quick reiteration, destructive testing, very fast moving, because Kennedy had declared that there was a missile gap. We were behind the Russians. They had launched the Sputnik into orbit, and we should catch up with them, particularly for strategic reasons. And so I was one of the young engineers that said, I'll help with this. It also was a ticket out of the Vietnam War, which I deeply disagreed with at the time and didn't wish to leave my bones in some random rice paddy over there. So, and then I got to, I decided after the general in charge of our project, the reentry guidance vehicle, disclosed that it was going to be multiple warhead. It was MIRV. And I decided, one nuclear warhead is bad enough, but having a MERV meant that a single booster could take out the major industrial centers of a country like Russia. And so I decided at that point I was going to make toys for somebody else, and I decided to go to graduate school in oceanography. So the deep taproot goes back to Benjamin Franklin in the United States. He was in many ways the first scientific American and incredible statesman, founder of our country, one of the essential founders. And I would point out that our founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin, all were involved with science. And that set a different parameter for our country as it was formed. We took science and facts into consideration. And so that was an amazing thing. Now, in his day, science was the province of the wealthy, people who had extra time and could collect butterflies or do things like that, or rocks, and sometimes they got involved with actual science. Franklin was born into a family of tallow renderers who were involved in the candle making business. And he decided to apprentice himself to a printer, got involved in the communications business, and that was a game changer, and ended up running an amazingly successful printing business that became the most wealthy person in the colonies in the end at the time he died. So he made quite a few contributions. The picture here shows him studying the electric field that produces lightning. Essentially, he's measuring the field strength and the charge sign, and it was a century before any scientist did better lightning research than he did. And somehow that gave him special status. So when he came to Europe to negotiate for aid during the American Revolution, the fact that he was a scientist gave him a standing that very few diplomats had. But he invented practical things like the Franklin stove. And that was not a random thing. He actually calculated what the population of the United States would be over time due to immigration and reproduction, and how much wood they would consume, and concluded that we were going to run out of wood by burning it. And we needed wood to make ships and houses and a whole bunch of other things that were made out of wood. And so the idea that you would burn it all to make heat inefficiently went against his grain. So he invented a stove that only took a quarter of the firewood that a fireplace would take to produce the same heating effect. And he promoted the first American sewers, the first American lending library, the first fire company, all sorts of things like that. He was a do-gooder. He was a rare individual who traveled in the United States, for what would be the United States. And so he was familiar with the colonies, which meant you rode on horseback in his time. And he crossed the ocean repeatedly as a representative, not only for the Philadelphia and Pennsylvania colony, but also for the many other colonies. He was so well regarded that other colonies hired him to represent themselves. So he was a rare person that traveled across the ocean repeatedly. I mean, most people came to immigrate and that was it. They had enough. And he also, by living in Philadelphia, was surrounded by instrument makers who made, among other things, the first thermometers. And so the president of Harvard had a thermometer, the president of Yale and Princeton had thermometers. They kept records of temperature in those days. And so he had a thermometer. He took what amounted to bucket temperatures as he crossed the Atlantic Ocean. And he knew about the Gulf Stream. He not only observed the temperature change and the current change, but also the species that were found in it. And he correctly described the fact that there's a Gulf Stream gyre that goes around the Atlantic Ocean, around the Sargasso Sea, and its origin in the Straits of Florida for the East Coast, and roughly charted its position. And it had a practical reason too, because as Postmaster General for the new colonies, they wanted to save time getting across to Europe and back. So stemming a current was a waste of time, which the British did all the time. And so his cousin Folger from Nantucket, who was a whaleman, and he collaborated to make this chart. So in some respects, this is the first oceanographer. And there was another really key person who's almost as deep a root, and that's Matthew Fontaine Maury, who actually wrote the first textbook, Physical Geography of the Sea. And he was trained as a naval officer and circumnavigated the world and had tremendous sailing experience, but he had a career-ending stagecoach accident that made him lame in 1835, and they assigned him to the Depot of Charts and Records, which was like a dead end if you're in the career business in that day. However, he noticed that they had all these logbooks, and he had the data extracted from the logbooks and made sailing directions and seasonal current, wind and current charts that were actionable, that actually made American commerce more effective on the world stage. And he distributed logbooks specifically to collect the data he wanted, and then he organized a global effort with the International Hydrographic Bureau, which is in Monaco. They chartered that in 1853, so now they collect data for the world. So this is an amazing thing. And among the things they collected was water depth. And they didn't have sonar to measure the water depth. You actually lowered a weight out of the bottom and you measured the wire. And it wasn't until steam engines became available that you could do that in a practical way for oceanic depths. So this is the first charting of the ocean water depths, which turned out to be crucial for laying the transatlantic cable system, and then later the global cable system for other depth measurements. So it changed the world once you had telegraph across the ocean from a 4-mile-an-hour world with the average speed of a sailing ship to almost instantaneous. So this guy, Henry Stommel, my advisor, was an amazing physical oceanographer who triggered large field programs by simply asking a question that was profound. And he was very unassuming. And Franklin, in his time, made progress in organizations by asking questions that caused people to reach conclusions that he wanted. And Stommel was one of the sort of Franklin-esque in that respect. And he pioneered many theories, including the westward intensification of the Gulf Stream and the countercurrent and what we would call AMOC. And he was very interested in alternate stable conditions of currents and tipping points, we would call them today, among many other things. If you pick any subfield in physical oceanography, there's a high likelihood that he wrote the first paper in that subfield. Just an amazing guy and lovely individual. And so when I was at MIT, there had never been a coastal oceanography course taught there. Nobody measured the coastal ocean. They did the deep sea. Some biologists worried about the shoreline, but the continental shelf was not very much paid attention to. So he organized a reading course in coastal oceanography, and there was very little literature. One of the pieces was a book by Bigelow called Physical Geography of the Gulf of Maine. He also did a companion book on the fishes of the Gulf of Maine. And so I went to the MIT library to check out a copy of this, and it was missing from the collection. So I went down to Woods Hole to the NBL library, which is operated jointly by Woods Hole and NBL, and their copy was missing. So I said, well, he was on the faculty at Harvard, I'll go up to Harvard to the Widener Library and I'll get a copy up there. Went up there and they were moving that part of the library, so it was in one of 100 cardboard boxes which they were not going to open so I could look. And so I said, well, you know, maybe, just maybe, there's a departmental library in comparative zoology where he was on the faculty. I'll go and see whether they have it there. And I went up to and the very nice secretary said, well, we don't have such a library. But then she said, you know, Dr. Bigelow's in his office. Maybe he has a copy. Huh. So it was just after lunch, and I spent the entire afternoon talking with Bigelow about what was going on in the founding of Woods Hole Oceanographic, how it came to be. Just an amazing gentleman of the old school. Very well-mannered, well-spoken, very lucid. He reminded me of my grandfather, who had been personnel director for the Bureau of the Budget, which is now OMB, and led their audits of the U.S. Treasury every year. And he had run big organizations, smooth and genteel, and Dr. Bigelow reminded me greatly of him. And so I found him in his office, and it was amazing. He had been interested in the Gulf of Maine, so there was a National Academy Study Commission to see whether there should be an oceanographic lab on the East Coast. There was one on the West Coast that Lisa Beal is familiar with, named Scripps, and the question was, should there be one on the East Coast? And so they had a National Academy meeting, and Lilly organized it, and Henry Briant Bigelow was put in charge of the committee that wrote the report on it and looked at sites where such a place could be built. And of course, it takes considerable money to build an institution, and the ship and the buildings and the docks and all of that. So he needed to do some fundraising. And it turns out that one of his students, a guy named Columbus Islin, was a member of the New York Yacht Club and had his own sailboat, and after a while got tired of just racing and cruising and wanted to do something scientific. Hydrography was a new thing. He outfitted his personal yacht called Chance with a winch and did hydrography of the Gulf of Maine with Dr. Bigelow, and Dr. Bigelow wrote up the results for his book. And so he was an interesting guy, and the people who were involved in New York Yacht Club included the Rockefellers and a bunch of other people with considerable resources. And so Bigelow wanted to build the institution in Gloucester, Massachusetts, because there was a big fishing fleet. There was maintenance facilities for ships of the size he wanted, and it was convenient to the Gulf of Maine. The Rockefellers, on the other hand, owned a house on Penzance Point in Woods Hole, and they wanted to see the institution built in Woods Hole. There was already a NBL, which was well established. There was already a fisheries lab there run by the government. And it turned out that when you're writing the checks, you get to make the call. And so that's how it got to be in Woods Hole rather than in Gloucester or some other alternate location. So he became the first director, had deep roots with the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, and he was very well connected with the moneyed class. And so he raised, I think, just short of $1.5 million, and they built the ship, the first ship called the Atlantis, which was a steel-hulled ketch, and it was built in Germany at Horsfessel, which was the best builder of steel ships at that time. And they also built the Sea Cloud, which Maria Gross and I have been on as part of the IOF fundraising effort. And there was some controversy about whether they should patronize a German yard, because the war was looming in the future, and people thought maybe they shouldn't, but they also had the best price and the best product, so that won. So as a young physical oceanographer at MIT, the last year that the Atlantis was in the area was that year, so I got to walk aboard it at Monroe Shipyard. The ship had been dismasted by running into the Tampa Skyway Bridge. Whoever was in charge of calculating the height of the mast relative to the bridge had made a little bit of a goof, and it collapsed the mast, and so it was in Monroe's shipyard, and they acoustically gauged the plates and decided it was not worth rebuilding it. And the Chilean Navy, on the other hand, wanted a research vessel, and their welders worked cheaper in Chile than they did in East Boston. So they took it down, and it's called Islas Orcadas, down in Chile. And so this guy, Columbus Island, great yachtsman, and Walton Smith was a yachtsman, as well as a British marine biologist. He was hired to try to solve the sponge blight, which was tearing up the commercial sponge industry. Before we had cellulose sponges, the only sponges were the ones that grew naturally. And it was very profitable up until the sponge blight. And so he was an officer of the British government, and they asked him to tour the oceanographic labs in the United States to see what was going on this side of the pond. And they ended up causing him to go up to Woods Hole, and Columbus Island was the second director at that time. And so he put Walton up in the director's house, and the two of them hit it off famously. They were on the same page. They both had yachting backgrounds. They both had an interest in the ocean and ocean laboratories. And Columbus Island suggested that Walton should start a similar lab to Woods Hole down south, probably in Miami. So when Walton Smith ran into the first president of the University of Miami, Foster Ashe, by accident in the quadrangle, he had something in mind. And he obviously impressed Foster Ashe, and so he didn't have any money, but he gave Walton a hunting license, and they appointed him to be an assistant professor in zoology at the University of Miami. And he had a couple of rooms in the Cardboard College over at the University of Miami, which was a repurposed apartment building that had been partly finished before the Depression started. So this is me as I was in my last summer at MIT as a postdoc in 1971 in my office on the 14th floor of the Green Building. And my offer letter was written by this guy, F.G. Walton Smith, who was the dean of Rasmus. Recently, they had changed the name to Rasmus, as we recently heard. So the people that I worked with at MIT first, this is Charles Stark Draper, who invented the inertial navigation system and founded the MIT Instrumentation Lab, which I worked on the MERV, and this just gives some background on the different things that he did. He started off pointing cannons on battleships in World War II, greatly improving their accuracy. During the Korean War, the MiGs were shooting down the Sabre jets 10-1 until Draper put a fire control system, then it went the other way, 10 MiGs for every Sabre jet. And when the Cold War sprung up, the ICBMs became a thing, and the group Skipper Jay I worked with were the designers of the Titan guidance system. The people that did Apollo were down the hall one way, the people who did Polaris were down the hall the other way, and there was a guidance system for nuclear submarines. These guidance systems could not be jammed by radio because they did not depend on radio. They doubly integrated the acceleration so you know what your position change was from some well-known initial position. So it could not be stopped. And the first demonstration with the bomber, they put a shade over the window front window of a bomber and flew it from Hanscom Field in Massachusetts to Southern California blind and landed it blind. So that was the proof of the pudding. And so by the time I got there, we were into a re-entry guidance, which required 100 Gs of acceleration. So we had to build a stable system that could stand 100 Gs plus 50 Gs of vibration, slowly swept. So that was an amazing group of people doing things. And for that, Charles Stark Draper was awarded Institute Professor in the Aeroastro Department at MIT. So that's another grade above a conventional professor. And it gives you a stipend of, in those days it was $250,000 salary, and you had a couple of $100,000 for an expense account. And you could teach if you wanted. There were about a dozen of those at any given time, and Charlie Stark Draper was one of them. And Harold Edgerton was another, and he got his in electrical engineering. And the reason I bring him up is he was the inventor of the strobe flash. He was originally invented it for nighttime surveillance in the Second World War. They started off kicking flash powder out of the back of a DC-4 and igniting it in the air to take nighttime pictures of strategic things in the Second World War. And so he developed a strobe flash and he had a DC-4 full of batteries that stored the energy to make the flash at a high enough intensity. And he founded EG&G to commercialize that in the high-speed photography. He developed a camera with a rotary prism that could create slow-motion photography of nuclear explosions, which was obviously strategic. And so he was an incredible guy. I went to meet him because I wanted a strobe to take dye streak photographs. I was tired of handling flash bulbs underwater with wetsuit mittens on. And so I wondered, was there a flash available? And turns out that EG&G was developing one for Nikonos cameras, which were brand new at the time for underwater use. And he said his engineers could bring a couple of them over after lunch if I wanted. And then he took me down to the chemical reagent storage room, and we went through different kind of fluorescent compounds. And he suggested fluorescein, which I'd already come to. But amazing guy. When I met him, he was having 4 conversations at his office. There was a phone on each ear. He was talking to 2 different people through 2 separate phones. There was a technician he was talking to, and there was me. And as near as I could tell, he didn't miss anything in any of the 4 conversations. Just amazing bandwidth. So this is the guy that founded Rasmus, we call it today, and he was an amazing guy. As dean, he was a top-down kind of leader, and so he didn't have much truck with junior scientists. The main way I met him in the early days, I lived on Key Biscayne, and I would bicycle home, and I needed his signature on proposals to the Navy or NSF, and so I'd stop by his house and he'd sign the proposal so it could be printed in those days. And but when he retired, he was much more relaxed. He loved sitting at his bar down here in the Smith Commons. He and Harrison Stewart, who was the founder of NOAA, conspired to have only one bar. Of course, they couldn't have one in a government facility, so it's obviously going to be on this side of the street. But they didn't put a lunchroom in the NOAA facility so that NOAA scientists would come over here and mix with Rasmus scientists, at least to eat lunch, and probably to use the bar once in a while. So Walton Smith was an amazing guy, and Harrison Stewart and he knew each other very well, and I think that the selection of Miami's site for AOML was not a coincidence. While I was a student at MIT, I wrote part of a proposal to build a AOML facility in Winthrop, Mass, hoping that I could live up there and work in this new facility. I was disgusted to find that these people in Miami beat us out. And later on, I was pretty pleased that they had. That there was another lady by the name of Monica Abbott, who was his long-term secretary, the wife of a missionary in China. A lovely lady, incredible memory, tremendous historical archive between her ears. So questions of why was Walton Smith so successful? Well, he was a good scientist, but he was a particularly good judge of character and scientific ability. And so his ability to recruit key people played a big role in the rise of the lab after it became established. And he had tremendous connections with the British and American sport fishing and yachting community. He was living in Nassau, and as a government official, he would have been invited to every important party in Nassau. And so he knew people there, and of course, the aristocracy in Europe was wintering in the Bahamas rather than the German-held parts of France that they would have ordinarily gone to on the Riviera. So he attracted donor support, which was key to getting our physical plant going and so forth. He also had deep connections to the National Geographic and the Grosvenors. It is no accident that the major building complex on the campus was the Grosvenor complex, north-south. And so that connection was very meaningful and was positive in my eyes when I was looking at coming to work here. The fact that the Grosvenors had been involved with this outfit was a good thing. And he was Commodore of the Biscayne Yacht Club, which is the old guard yacht club in Miami where the old money lives. And he also was Commodore of Cat Key Yacht Club in the Bahamas, again, the place where many of the industrialists and donor class people recreated. And so he had knowledge and relationships with lots of people over many years, and that led to many boat donations and the like. He also had a deep knowledge of people in government. He knew people locally, he knew all the commissioners of the Miami-Dade Commission, County Commission. He knew the representatives for Congress and the Senate. He knew people in local governments and state government. I mean, this guy had connections on connections. He had more connections than just about any person that I've ever met. So that was a big deal. And he had been the dean so long that people associated him with oceanography. And this was one of the donations and one of many, the Gerda 78-foot North Sea trawler. And this was used as an oceanographic vessel. Most of the donations were sold for money, but this one was actually used. And it didn't have a sail and it didn't have bilge keels, so it rolled a lot. It had a gimbal dining table, as did the Atlantis. And so the ship would roll around and the table would remain flat, so your soup wouldn't spill, but it'd be under your chin and then down in your lap and then under your chin. If you put a straw in your mouth and timed it just right. So I took a class, my first oceanography class, with 35 students, physical oceanography and a lot of ocean engineering students at the time. who were getting out of Vietnam. And I took them to sea on the day I'd signed the vessel up. It was blowing about 30 knots out of the northeast. And so it was rougher than a cob out there, and almost every one of them were seasick. There were two guys that had served on us on ships in the Navy, tin cans that rolled a lot. They were functional. I was functional, and the marine technician Manolo Aparicio, who was a Cuban Navy expat, were functional, but the rest of them were pretty much down below. And the ship had not had its decks kept wet enough, and when they filled the oil and overfilled it, it spilled on the deck and it rolled down into the bilge and then into the cabins. So the aroma of the place, not only was it rolling like stink, but it stank. And so a lot of theoreticians were birthed in that class. So among the things that happened, Miami didn't have its own cafeteria in the old days. People went out to the quay or onto the mainland for lunch or brought their lunch. And so this ship was the first drilling ship, and it was a concept that was hatched in the bar at the English pub. And so Walton felt comfortable in the English pub, and they would have senior staff meetings out there, which I didn't have any part in, but it was a lovely spot. And among the department heads was Cesare, who had a tremendous amount of money from the U.S. Navy at the time, and outfitted the Gillis with a traction winch that could handle huge coring equipment, which he used to great effect in the Mississippi Delta and elsewhere. And so he was the first to propose that we build a ship with a drill rig in the middle of it, and we drill down through the Earth's crust into the moho. So, and we didn't have the financial wherewithal at the university, and it ended up being headquartered at Scripps and then later in Texas. But, and this is Cesare. It's an early picture. One of certainly the founders. He had a whole crew of coring techs, muscular guys who could handle the weights. He had a whole crew of ladies that would pick through the microfossils of foraminifera, as they are called, which can relate to past climates. And you can actually extract temperature estimates by doing interesting chemistry on the shells. So he was quite the operator. And this is a G-rated seminar, so I won't go into some of the aspects of this operation. There were some other people that were recruited that were terrific. Chris Harrison among them, Cambridge educated geophysicist, and he cleverly dated Earth magnetic reversals by measuring the magnetization of iron minerals within basaltic lava flows in Iceland. Iceland's on the mid-ocean ridge, and it's almost always an eruption going on somewhere, at least every couple of years. So you get a very high-resolution record, which you can use. And he later served as dean. And he made peace with the main campus. During Walton's era, there was great friction because the main campus had tried to take away the Rosenstiel endowment from the lab. And maybe the reason for the naming was to tie that down, but that created a climate of distrust that cut both ways. So when Walton was getting to 65, they were going to make him retire at 65 years and 1 millisecond. So he prepared the IOF, Institute of Ocean, and in order to get a funding base and a publication and so forth, and he wanted to build Planet Ocean as a museum for marine science. So the area where my office was and where Roland's office is now was set up as a space to entertain people from IOF. So there was a kitchen there, there was a beautiful porch overlooking Bear Cut. There were rooms that you could sleep in. They were like hotel rooms. They had showers, they had closets, and each one had an independent air conditioning system. So he would put up people he was cultivating in those spaces. And when I came down to be interviewed for my job, and I stayed in what would be my new office when it was an apartment. And later it was converted when we enticed meteorology to move from main campus to this campus. It was reconverted into joint MPO space back when that merger occurred. So the original place where it was on main campus. Roger Leer was another amazing guy, a father of Doppler sonar systems as well as radar systems. So the national network of Doppler radars is really an outgrowth of what he did here at Rasmus. Incredible job. So if you get an early warning for a tornado, you can thank Leer for that. He also developed Doppler sonar systems usable in ADCPs and for anti-submarine warfare applications. He was a unique individual. He raised an entire second family as a senior citizen, and he claimed his new children as dependents, and so he got a Social Security check that was pretty amazing. And Rainer Black was another one of the pioneers. His father had manned a German meteorological station in Greenland during the Second World War. It was captured by the Allies. And he pioneered atmospheric computer modeling and potential temperature, but from the ocean side of things, he developed ocean models where they used density coordinates in the vertical rather than depth coordinates. And so it turns out that physical properties propagate along constant density surfaces, so that's the intrinsic thing, that's the best way to do it. It makes a mess out of the boundary conditions, so that gave him a lot of heartburn, but he's an amazing guy. He's still research active at Ceres, he's physically active in Colorado, and he's a hell of a musician. He plays a mean recorder. I have no idea, but he had the office next to me where you're sitting, and one Saturday I was in at the lab, and 3 Germans came in with recorders, and the 4 of them sat and played Bach on recorders in his office. So I sat there for about 3 hours. It was an amazing concert, no idea. And Östlund, who pioneered tritium measurements based on fallout from weapons testing and the relatively short half-life of tritium, made it a terrific tracer to see where new water was entering the deep ocean, where the deep water mass formations were going. And he brought a Swedish glass blower by the name of Per Nelson, who made this amazing complex seamless glass apparatus to do the first measurements. It's like a room full of glass all connected together without a single seam in it. And later they had a easier to maintain system. And then Klaus Root, who was also on the faculty here, also Swedish, helped calculate vertical diffusion in the permanent oceanic thermocline based on this unique low-level tritium data, which is something of great interest. Stommel and others had tried to estimate this, and this was one of the first examples where you actually had data that would be useful in it. He also, when he moved from Woods Hole to Miami, suggested that I should look for a job at Rasmus. So you can blame Klaus, I guess. And we had Otis Brown and Bob Evans, who basically fathered scientific satellite remote sensing of temperature. They were both former employees of NASA as consultants. And so they could navigate the data and geolocate it in ways that none of the other groups, a lot of other groups had pretty pictures of meanders and so forth from space or clouds, but they couldn't geolocate it accurately enough to accumulate the data. And Otis and Bob did that. They also were involved in the rescue of the Apollo 13 astronauts. They worked with NASA to figure out how to get the guys home. So he also, Otis also worked with Howard Gordon from the main campus on color sensing from space, and was able to use that to determine concentrations of chlorophyll A, which could be used to look at the distribution of plankton from space, just like the remote sense of temperature. And Joe Prospero, who's graced our audience today, pioneered scientific dust collection from places from Barbados to Iceland. I can never forget going to a remote corner of High Main, Iceland's island south of Iceland, and there's this dust collection thing sitting there with a UN property stamp on it, and Joe Prospero, I didn't have any idea that he had a station that far north. So what Joe did to lay down a long historical record of dust is really important if you're going to try to figure out how dust varies with climate or climate varies with dust. And we routinely use dust observations by Earth satellites now in the hurricane prediction game to figure out where a hurricane is likely to form or not in the hurricane formation region. So, and Frank Malero pioneered density determinations with tremendous precision for the equation of state from first principles. So he could measure the different components and then combine them together to derive the equation of state. And that's an important thing for physical oceanography as well as chemistry. And he could do other aqueous solutions, so quite the achievement. And Harry D., very clever mathematician, and did many things with the Navy. He was about to be drafted for Vietnam, and he took a summer job, and with a group that were working for the Navy, and his ability to solve equations was so good that they called up the Navy department and said, "Hey, we want this guy." So he ended up getting a job working for the Navy doing calculations. And so one of the most clever things that he did with Hin Nguyen, who was a Vietnamese expat, they developed a apparatus, the Miami sound machine, which had multiple frequencies, and he would transmit what looked like white noise from the system. So it was not like a discrete frequency. And so if you were an observer, you couldn't tell that you were being surveilled because you were just hearing white noise. And then in order to get the echo, you had to convolve that transmitted signal with the reflected signal, so now you could see what it was you were looking at. Of course, it was multi-frequency, so it gave you a lot more information. And notably, it requires significantly less power than conventional sonar, so it's better for whales or other mammals. So he did many, many things. It's just, whoa. So, this is, let's see, I need to go back one. Yeah, Harding Michelle. She became the, let's go back one more. She was the first female graduate student at Miami. She came from Duke in 1946, and she worked for Walton Smith in the Cardboard College. And that's taken it back as far as we can go pretty much. She was at the meeting in 1949 where Walton announced the creation of the University of Miami Marine Laboratory. And then she worked there for a year together with her new husband, Ari. And then they went to Michigan for PhD. studies, and she was using plankton from the Gulf Stream. And Harding became the first female full professor at Erasmus. She went to sea regularly at a time when women didn't do so, and despite having had polio when she was younger and requiring crutches at sea to get around the ship, she did it anyway, and that was not going to stop her. She had established, among many other things, that the northern cold water species of plankton were found in the deep undercurrent beneath the Gulf Stream in collaboration with current profiler work of Walter Dewing. Just an amazing person, just unstoppable, you know, the unsinkable Molly Brown. She was one of those people. And I would talk to her by phone for years after she retired to keep her up to date with what was going on. A lovely person. So this last slide, there is a marine lab at East Point Marine Science Center in Nahant, Massachusetts, getting back to the Nahant connection. It is operated by Northeastern University in Boston. And this is an oceanographic lab that was founded by Nathan W. Reiser. He was their founding dean. And it started by accident. There was an estate that was owned by Henry Cabot Lodge that was donated to the U.S. government and used as a gun emplacement during World War II, like the guns of Navarone, huge guns, and well dug in. And then after the Second World War, it was used during the early stage of the Cold War as a night surface-to-air missile base, both the A and C variants. And then it was put on excess property by the GSA, and so the Kennedys wanted to build a 4-tower condo development on Eastern Point. And a group of us in the Conservation Commission were told by one of the 3 selectmen that he'd been offered an apartment in the new condos if they were successful. And you know, at the time John Kennedy was president, his kid brother was the Attorney General, and his youngest brother was the freshman senator from Massachusetts. And so we decided, it was offered to nonprofit, first the town, then nonprofits. And I was an oceanography student at MIT, so I said this would be a great spot for an oceanographic lab. And so at that point, we shopped it around to 30 plus institutions of higher learning who could sustain such a laboratory. And the people at Northeastern had tried on the South Shore in Duxbury and been left at the altar. And so they had a business plan, they had money identified, and the chairman of Northeastern's board was John Lowell, who was our moderator in the town hall meetings at Nahant. Just an amazing guy. So he sweetened the pot with more money because he didn't want to see a condo development overlooking his place or any of the other dozen Lowell families. And you may remember a saying, here's to dear old Boston, the land of the bean and the cod, where the Cabots speak only to the Lowells, and the Lowells speak only to God. Those Lowells. Anyway, that's it, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions or.
Good. Thank you very much. Questions? So that if you have questions, I will come with this microphone here so the Zoom people can hear you.
Okay, thank you, John. Just a quick comment about the Atlantis one. Didn't end up in Chile.
About?
The Atlantis one.
I'm sorry, let me walk over here. My hearing microphone.
The Woods Hole boat, the Atlantis one, ended up in Argentina.
Yeah.
I thought you said Chile. And
Yeah.
it's still in use until 1994. Actually, Javier went as an undergrad in the last sail of the Atlantis one, when actually broke again the mastic. and it was his first and last sail for Javier. So it's still part of the history of oceanography.
Yeah.
Thank you for compiling all that information. It was a lot better than hearing from the textbook, and you made a lot of connections that we wouldn't have gotten otherwise.
Yeah.
Do you know what the FG in FG Walton Smith stands for? This is something that comes up every time I go on the ship.
Okay. Well, I know somebody who can answer that. Maria Gross, who worked for F.G. Walton Smith.
Frederick.
Yeah, I become with my.
Frederick George Walton Smith.
Say it again for the Zoom audience.
Frederick George Walton Smith.
Yeah. That's not working.
No, it is working for the people who watched us online. It's not for amplification either. It's something.
Yeah.
I'd like to make a brief comment about Frank Valero.
Yeah.
The measurements, the sort of measurements that he made are central to understanding the ocean carbon cycle, which is the whole climate issue.
Yeah.
I mean, he is a hero. He
Yeah.
has 600 publications, and the last time I checked, he had 75,000 citations.
Holy
And
cow.
the guy.
I have just a little space on the slide, so obviously I did that. No, thank you for that.
Yeah, the other issue is the Apollo 13 and Bob Evans. I mean, that guy is a hero.
Yeah.
You may recall that the problem was they were utterly reliant on the output of a battery for the return to Earth. And they had to absolutely know how much power they could draw from that battery.
Yeah.
And it just happened that Bob Evans, before coming to the laboratory, worked for a company that made the batteries that went in the Apollo.
Yeah.
And so that he was the authority on that battery, and the whole planning of the return mission was completely dependent on his knowledge about that battery and his faith in the knowledge about that battery.
Wow.
So he was remarkable. That was a remarkable instrument.
Yeah.
And so I understand when he retired, that they had a large contingent from NASA that came down to.
Yeah, there were people who came down, that's why I knew about it.
Great, thanks very much for that. I just wanted to point out that you flipped over one slide, but you also flipped over another slide that you didn't mention, didn't notice, and that was just after Cesare.
Oh,
And there was a slide for Bob Ginsberg. I had to throw that up there.
yeah, Bob Ginsberg was an incredible guy. He had come from Shell Oil, very well connected with the industry, and he had a comparative sedimentology lab at the old they had a station on Fisher Island. Yeah, there was a quarantine station back before they had vaccines. They would quarantine people who came with diseases, and this station was still owned by the government, and somehow Bob Ginsberg, and there was a parallel lab that was operated by Gene Shin for U.S. Geological Survey, and they had their own little kingdom over there with beautiful coconut palms around and so forth, and they had a course that they would put on for working geologists showing how sediments are laid down today, so that you could understand how the sediments might have been laid down in the ancient deposits you're drilling into. So, just an amazing guy. He was an organizer. He knew all kinds of people, and he and I conspired to have a jack-up demonstration, a jack-up drilling platform during one of the science meetings in New Orleans. We had a chartered school bus and took him down to the bayou, got on this jack-up rig and took it out. And he ended up jacking it up on the Bahama Banks and doing a drilling series across that. So what we know about the internal structure of the Bahama Banks. He was a great organizer, a tremendous person, and he lived very, very frugally, but then he left an endowed chair to the lab at the end. So he was frugal with a purpose, that guy.
Okay, I don't see more. Yeah, okay, one from Diana, and then I think we have to get out of this room here. The biologists are waiting outside.
John, you didn't say anything much about Fritz Kochi.
Pardon?
You didn't say much about Fritz Kochi.
I didn't know him, so I
Let
thought mostly.
let Diana ask.
Quick question about the ship, the prologue, the drilling vessel. Am I understanding?
Would you speak in so I can hear the
No,
prologue?
that will not help.
Oh,
The drilling vessel, the prologue. Am I understanding that originated, was that the first of its kind vessel?
Yeah,
It originated.
yeah, it was, the idea originated here. It was not carried to fruition. There was a MOHO project which was very scandal prone and gave deep sea drilling a bad name in the beginning. Big money. There was tremendous transformation in ocean science that happened because of the Second World War. Before that, it was kind of a rich man's hobby. And then during the war, it was science and engineering that won the war. And so science and engineering took on a whole new importance, and it also became big money. And the Navy had deep resources, particularly for anti-submarine warfare and other things. And just an amazing transformation. And thank you.
Okay, then thank you very much. Thank you all for coming and for listening in Zoom. We have quite a number of people in Zoom as well. Happy holidays and come again. We have the next seminar. I think we still have one more in December. Not like this, a more scientific one.
Yeah.